It's a beautiful day in the Judean wilderness. That is to say, of course, it might be a stormy day in the wilderness, but any day in the wilderness in the early spring is a good day. The spring rains have carpeted the normally barren landscape in a riot of green grass and vibrant wildflowers. It might be muddy and stormy or dry and sunny, but since on this day in mid-March I am unable to hop on a plane to Jerusalem, and most of you have similar limitations, I thought we could take an imaginary trip there together. We'll start our imaginary trip in Jerusalem, where a jaunt into the Judean wilderness is a nice day trip. If there are enough of us, we'll take a bus and pack a lunch, and be sure to get an early start because someone is sure to get lost at some point. Don't worry though, they're bound to show up eventually, probably on the back of a donkey. The wilderness is full of good Samaritans. We head east out of Jerusalem, passing under the Mount of Olives. Almost immediately you'll see a change in scenery as we enter the rain shadow, and the rock changes from the limestone of Jerusalem to the chalk of the wilderness. This video from Google Earth seems to have pictures from different seasons, so the change is more dramatic than it might be in reality, but hopefully you get a sense of it. It's spring in the wilderness, but it's still the wilderness. This is the land of the shepherds, the land David the shepherd likely referenced as he wrote of green pastures and still waters. Still, as you rush by on the highway at this time of year, you can catch tantalizing glimpses of hillsides covered with purple flowers. This is a second temple field study, which means we will mostly be visiting Hasmonean and Herodian sites. But in this land, layers of history build on and illuminate each other. If you're lucky, you'll have a tour guide who can speak knowledgeably about various eras of history and point out different places of interest as we pass. The road on which we are traveling roughly follows the ancient road between Jerusalem and Jericho. You may hear parts of it or all of it called the Ascent of Adummim. As you drive, your guide might talk about the history of this road or point out spots of interest like the traditional site of the Inn of the Good Samaritan, which is across the road from the remainders of a Crusader castle and a Roman fort, highlighting the importance of this route through various eras. If we had time, maybe we'd even stop and take a picture at the point where the road dips below sea level, but today we're in a hurry, so we'll keep going. As we zoom down from the hills, we can see at one point where the ancient road would have continued on to Jericho, but the modern road swings south before heading back east. Instead of heading further east, though, we are going to turn off the modern highway and continue south. This road also roughly follows an ancient route, though one that was likely less used. This road doesn't seem to be much traveled today, but our first hint that it has some historical significance is when we pass a Muslim site, Nebi Musa, or the grave of the prophet Moses. Geographically, this site does not fit with what we know of the death of Moses from Deuteronomy, who died on the other side of the Jordan and whose burial place is unknown. So if this is not his actual grave, why is this site here, seemingly in the middle of nowhere? It was likely built initially as part of the pilgrimage route between Jerusalem and Mecca. Mount Nebo, the location of Moses' death, can be seen from here. So probably this site started by commemorating his death, and over time that shifted to a more specific claim about his burial site. So while this area is not well frequented today, we already see signs of its importance in history. We will see more as we go. We'll cross the Wadi Og. If it's raining in the hills, we may see quite a bit of water flowing here. Next, we'll pass a military base. It's a good thing it's Shabbat, or we might be headed into their firing range. We may find evidence of the weekday activities that take place here as we pass. We're getting close now, and our first goal of the day comes into view. Hyrcania, the Hasmonean fortress. There are also 3 or so Iron Age settlements or forts in this valley, situated close to the road, that also bear witness to the occasional importance of this route. We might pause at the middle one, possibly Sakaka from Joshua 15, because it will come up in our discussion later. We still have a hike ahead of us to get to our main stop, so let's hop off the bus, make sure we have our hats, sunscreen, or rain gear, and as always, water. The hiking trails here are marked by painted stripes on rocks, so keep your eyes peeled for those so you don't get lost. As we hike, we'll have opportunities to observe the flora and fauna and firing range trash in the area. While it is a fairly barren area, it's surprising how much biodiversity there is. Hyrcania is one of roughly 7 desert fortresses that were built up and used by Herod the Great. Some might include the Herodian as an 8th, but as you can even see on this map, it's just on the edge of the desert. That and other aspects tend to put it in a different category. So we're left with 7 that have quite a few similarities and some significant differences. These desert fortresses are both fascinating and puzzling. We know they served as a place for the ruling class to store treasure and to retreat when threatened, but we're not always sure why the exact sites were chosen or if they served other strategic purposes. Some of them pretty clearly guard routes of significance, like Cypros, while others seem pretty far off the beaten track, like Hyrcania. All of them are on hills that could be fortified, but in the wilderness, fortification without water is a death sentence. Therefore, all of them also had extensive water systems, including cisterns and aqueducts. We will see remains of parts of those water systems today. If there was any other unifying reason for these fortresses to be placed where they are, we don't seem to know what it is. There did seem to be a lot of fringe religious activity in the wilderness, like the Essenes at Qumran, so someone has suggested that these fortresses helped keep an eye out for any seditious leanings. I do think about the Holy Family fleeing to Egypt and wonder how many of these fortresses might they have had to slip by on their way. If we look at a map, it seems that these fortresses are almost, but not quite, in eyesight of each other. I would guess that on a clear day, someone could stand in a high tower or climb a nearby hill and signal to one or two of the other fortresses, and perhaps an emergency message of some sort could be relayed that way. While Herod made the fortresses famous, all of them probably existed in some form before Herod. Several of them were Hasmonean fortresses first, and it's possible they were used in some form even before then. David is said to have visited the stronghold, which in Hebrew is Metzad, or Metzadah. I don't think we can prove that the stronghold was the Masada we know today, but the location fits, as well as the geography of a high defensible plateau. If these places were used in more ancient times, they probably were not well fortified, as there is very little archaeological evidence left behind from before the Hasmonean period. Archaeologically, many of the fortresses have Hasmonean remains that confirm the written accounts that they were built by one or more of the Hasmonean rulers. Most of the remains, though, are Herodian, as the paranoid king caused them to be built up and expanded, both for protection and comfort. Ironically, once Herod came to power, many of the Hasmoneans were imprisoned or executed at the fortresses that had initially been built for their protection. Herod's descendants apparently continued this tradition of using the fortresses to imprison political enemies. Josephus suggests that John the Baptist was imprisoned in Machaerus. Many of these fortresses were used by Jewish resistance around 70 AD, with the story of Masada being especially made famous by Josephus. After that, though, the fortresses were mostly abandoned and fell into disrepair. Some of them saw some revival as monasteries and have Byzantine and later remains attesting to that. Hyrcania, aka Khirbet Mird, was likely first fortified by John Hyrcanus and bears his name. It was destroyed in Rome in about 57 BCE and rebuilt by Herod after he came to power in 37 BCE. While it seems like it served mostly as a prison, there was still enough opulence to warrant a visit from Marcus Agrippa, son-in-law to the emperor, in 15 BCE. Days before Herod's own death, he sent his son Antipater here to be buried. We already mentioned a road through this valley, which this fortress could help guard, but it seems it was mostly a place to escape to if needed. Since I was last there, they have done a couple seasons of excavation, and this brings more information, as well as a plan to make this site more accessible to visitors someday. Even before excavation, though, a few remains of note were visible. Mosaics from the monastery were still visible on top of the site, and on the sides there is still some evidence of the fortifications that made this site defensible. We can also see the remains of some cisterns as well as the aqueducts that would have supplied water to this site, a vital resource in the middle of the wilderness. While this valley seems like the middle of nowhere, it does have a couple other points of interest. The first thing worth noting is its unique geology. You can possibly see this most clearly on this map from the Palestine Exploration Fund. There's clearly a difference in topography, but it's also detectable in satellite images. We can see that much of the wilderness area is quite hilly, but in comparison, this area is smooth, which explains why there was a route through this area. If we consult a geologic map, we can see the reason for this. This area has a different type of rock. The name of this valley may be different on different maps, but you are most likely to see it called the Bukei'a Valley, not to be confused with other Bukei'a valleys, or the Valley of Achor. That second one may sound familiar to you, and if so, it's because the Valley of Achor is mentioned a few times in the Bible. It's first mentioned in Joshua 7 as the place near Jericho where Achan was stoned. This causes it to be named the Valley of Achor, or the Valley of Trouble. It's mentioned again in Joshua 15 as part of the boundary of the tribe of Judah. The geographical context here makes it seem like the Valley of Achor they had in mind is quite a bit further north, maybe part of the Wadi Qelt system. However, if you want to take a moment to stand here and read the story of Achan, this is probably close enough to the actual location to get a feeling for the story. The Valley of Achor is also mentioned in Isaiah and Hosea. In both of those places, it's hard to know if they are talking about a physical location or if they are drawing a more metaphorical contrast, comparing the meaning of the word Achor with good things promised by God. Isaiah says the valley of trouble will be a resting place for herds, and he may just be contrasting trouble and rest. Similarly, Hosea says the valley of trouble will be a door of hope. They may just be contrasting the words. But it's also possible that both of them meant to draw a geographical picture as well. Wherever exactly the Valley of Achor was, it seems to have been roughly in this wilderness area. Nothing about this area makes it a good resting place for animals. Either it's too hot and dry and there's a risk of running out of food and water, or if you're too close to the places where water runs, you risk being washed away in a flash flood. That is not very hopeful. But both of these prophets are speaking to people who are about to be conquered and exiled or have already been exiled, depending on how you date the books. And they say, see this barren wasteland? It's troubled. It's not good for much, but God will take this barren land and make it into a place of resting and hope. And he will do the same for you in your troubled circumstances. And I think perhaps the authors of Ezekiel 47 and Revelation 22 were drawing on this picture when they wrote about the river flowing out of Jerusalem. Water from Jerusalem flows into the Kidron system, which drains through this valley. Can you imagine how a river flowing through this area could transform it from a barren wasteland into an area of rest and hope? There's one other place that I know of that may reference this valley. Psalm 84 talks of pilgrims set on going to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. They pass through the valley of Bukei'a and describe it as being transformed with springs and rain. The valley of Bukei'a isn't mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. I would suggest that there's a possible toponymic connection with Bukei'a, but that's uncertain at best. It's possible that Bukei'a, like Achor, is used metaphorically to mean the valley of weeping. Still, pilgrims probably did pass through this valley on their way to Jerusalem, and they too could have imagined how it would be transformed with springs and pools of water. Whether any of these passages actually intended to reference this valley could be debated, but I think that contrasting wilderness with well-watered places is a common theme in the Bible, and we can picture that here. So as we stand here, overlooking this valley, we can remember that life can be a place of trouble and weeping, but God promises springs and rivers that will transform it into places of rest and hope. Aside from Hyrcania, there are a few small archaeological remains in this valley. Specifically, there are 3 Iron Age sites that some have suggested are 3 of the cities of Judah in the wilderness from Joshua 15:61. The one we passed before Hyrcania was Khirbet es-Sumra, possibly Sakaka? It's never mentioned again in the Bible, but you'll find that some people are very interested in its identification. Why? Well, it turns out that Sakaka is also mentioned in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the Copper Scroll. This scroll purports to name over 60 hiding places for treasure. It mentions Bukei'a and the Valley of Achor, and thus could be describing a place near Hyrcania. And this is where Pilot Bob comes into the story. At some point, airplane pilot Charles Robert Morgan, aka Bob, came across a translation of the Copper Scroll and read about the unsuccessful attempts of the translator to find some of the treasures. He decides to start his own search. So, in 1986, he flies to Israel during his vacation, rents a car, drives to this valley. He locates Hyrcania and the 2 nearby tunnels, and he starts digging. Keep in mind, this is an active military training ground at this time, and he has no official permission to be here. So he has to dig mainly at night and hide during the day to avoid being discovered or injured. Every year he repeats this, flies to Israel, rents a car, drives to this valley, and starts digging. It's hard going. The tunnels are steep, and every spring as water flows through the valley, it dumps more debris in the tunnels. Over time, he convinces some friends to help and enlists help from some local Bedouin. Finally, in 1999, unable to reach the end of the tunnels himself, he approaches Israeli archaeologists for help and manages to convince them it's worth excavating. Official excavation starts in March of 2000. Over the course of the excavation, Bob gets married at the mouth of the tunnel. After several years, and a lot of money and effort, the ends of the tunnels are reached, and there's nothing. No treasure. A Hasmonean pot and a human skeleton of unknown origin, but nothing else. And it's not only disappointing, it's somewhat bizarre. Admittedly, the directions in the Copper Scroll are not the clearest, but there's seemingly nothing that fits the description better than this location. Why would someone go to the trouble and expense of making a scroll of copper to record these locations if there is no actual treasure? And why were these tunnels dug if not to store said treasure? Considering how much effort it was just to excavate them, imagine the effort to dig them out of the stone in the first place. Personally, I think the best explanation is that Herod wanted to punish the people he imprisoned, and his best idea was to force them to dig a dangerous and pointless tunnel. Maybe the Copper Scroll, instead of recording physical treasure, was made to memorialize the treasured people who lost their lives in this and similar pointless endeavors. Of course, not everyone is satisfied by that explanation. I just watched a rather sensationalized video of people looking for hidden chambers within the tunnels, hoping to find something that had previously been missed. And it's possible there is something yet to be found. The Judean desert holds many mysteries, so perhaps one day it will give up the answer to this riddle. As I researched this, I found some data from the new excavations at the site started in 2023. So perhaps as they publish their finds and excavate further, we will find more answers for some of our questions. As we conclude our time at Hyrcania, we can do a little more exploring on our way back to the bus. We can go to the south and look at what appears to be the remains of a monumental tomb of some sort. Or we can go north and see if we can check out one of those tunnels for ourselves. Either way, if you head east after that, you should hit the road and be able to find your way back to the bus. If we have time, maybe we'll go a little further south on the road to see where the Wadi Qelt drains through this valley. Then, back to the bus. Take a break, grab some pita and hummus, and then on to our second stop of the day, Jericho and Cypros. We'll make our way back to the highway and zoom down the modern road into the Jordan Valley, turning slightly north to arrive at Jericho. We'll take a little used road on the south side of the Wadi Qelt and park as the hills of the wilderness begin to rise up out of the Rift Valley. From here we'll go by foot, as pilgrims have done for ages, headed toward Jerusalem. We won't make it very far walking alongside the ancient aqueduct that still transports water along this path before we turn off the path and hike up the hill. The twin peaks that guard Wadi Qelt were apparently twin fortresses known as Taurus and Threx, or Threx and Taurus? I'm not sure we know which was which. These were also Hasmonean fortresses rebuilt and expanded by Herod. Our goal, the one on the south of the wadi, Herod renamed Cypros after his mother. If he also renamed the one on the north, its name doesn't seem to have survived. Today the site is called something I can't pronounce very well, Nusayb Uishera. We may have to climb over some old army tunnels and fortifications to reach the top, but once we're there, we'll pause for a moment just to enjoy the view. Looking south, we'll see the sparkle of the Dead Sea. Almost directly below us are the remains of Herod's palace in Jericho. If we have time, maybe we'll stop there on our way back to the bus. Looking slightly north, we may be able to pick out Tel Es Sultan, the location of ancient Jericho. Across the valley from us, we can see the hill on which our twin fortress, Threx or Taurus, would have stood. If we were slightly higher, we might be able to see where the fortress Doc was, today called Carental, and the location of a monastery. Then we'll turn and look up the wadi to the west. If visibility is good, we may be able to make out the three towers on the top of the Mount of Olives. Depending on where we stand, one of them may be just behind a hill, but two is enough to give us a sense of where we are. Now that we've gotten our bearings, we can look around this site a little. Surveys of this site, combined with what textual evidence we have, suggest that this was also a Hasmonean fortress with a fairly similar history to Hyrcania. This one, located above Herod's Jericho palace and guarding the main route from Jericho to Jerusalem, does have more strategic importance. Today, the peak is fairly pointy, but there is evidence that Herod had retaining walls built and filled to allow a much larger area at the top. If we make our way to the lower level, we can still see remains of some fresco, possibly in one of the two bathhouses that tell us of the luxury available to Herod and his guests here. The sun is starting to get low in the sky, and we have a bit more walking to do, so let's head down from here. We haven't really considered the biblical connections to this place, and that is partly because there are so many it's difficult to know where to focus. While the Wadi Qelt does not seem to be mentioned in the text by name, the route that passes along it between Jericho and the Jordan Valley and Jerusalem was likely in continual use. Any Bible character that travels to the east of Jerusalem likely came along this route. The Ascent of Adummim, as it's called in Joshua. This includes David fleeing from Absalom, any number of armies traveling for war, and of course Jesus himself traveled between Jerusalem and Jericho. He even based a parable on this route. The Good Samaritan may not have happened in reality, but people would have recognized the realism in it. This time of year, we might see a lot of water flowing in this valley, or almost none. Either one can be dangerous. We may even find evidence of the death that can catch an unprotected animal by surprise. Perhaps it was even this valley that was in mind as the psalmist wrote about the valley of the shadow of death. There are several springs that drained through this wadi system in ancient times, and many of them were harnessed through aqueducts to bring the water to the fortress we just left, including the springs in the Parat system. That part of the wadi may have been the location mentioned in Jeremiah 13:5, where Jeremiah was told to hide his loincloth. Some of the water in the aqueducts we see today comes from those springs. Since we're already part of the way up the Wadi Qelt, this is an excellent chance to experience part of the Ascent of Adummim that so many Bible characters have walked before us. We'll visit one last location with one last possible biblical connection. As we walk away from Cypros, we might glance back and try to imagine what it looked like in Jesus' day when the retaining wall was still present. But then, around one more corner, and the monastery of St. George of Choziba comes into view. This, of course, was not here during the biblical period, but it does have a long history in the land, starting around 420 CE, when monks started living in a cave here. They chose this place because of the possible connection to the place where the prophet Elijah was fed by ravens. The monastery has been abandoned and rebuilt several times. Most recently, it was re-established in 1878. If we are dressed modestly enough, we might check to see if it's open to visitors and take a look around. We had to cross the wadi to get to the monastery, and if the water is low enough, we'll walk back to our bus on this side of the wadi and maybe stop at the remains of Herod's palace to glance around. Not for long, though. Between storming fortresses and visiting holy sites, it's been a long day. We'll drag our weary bodies onto the bus one more time and watch the glow of the sunset as we zoom back to Jerusalem and our waiting dinners and showers. Thank you for coming along on this imaginary journey with me. While I love visiting all sorts of sites in the Holy Land, being able to get off the beaten track and to some of the less accessible places was always my favorite. I've tried to give enough information here to pique your interest, but there's always more to learn. So as always, I'll include some resources in the description. Let me know where you'd like to go next time. I hope we can explore together again soon.